Imagine this. You once felt an unbreakable bond with someone. The passion, the connection, the unshakable trust. But then something changed. You wake up one day and feel like strangers. Conversations feel forced. Conflicts never truly resolve. And deep down, you know something is off. What happened? Did the love just fade? Did life get in the way? Or was it something else? Something you didn't even realize was happening? The truth is, most relationships don't end because of a single catastrophic event. They break down slowly, over time, from small, unnoticed habits that destroy connection at its core. But here's the good news. You don't have to let this happen. Today, we're going to expose the 6 silent killers of relationships and, more importantly, how you can avoid them. Communication isn't just about talking. It's about truly understanding, connecting, and making the other person feel heard and valued. Most relationships don't fall apart because of one big fight. They erode over time because of the things that aren't said, the assumptions, the expectations, the silent frustrations that build and build until they explode. Or worse, until there's nothing left to say at all. Think about it. How many times have you held back from expressing what you really feel because you didn't want to start an argument? How often have you assumed that the other person should just know what you need without you having to say it? This is where relationships start to break down. Not in the moments of intense conflict, but in the quiet disconnections that go unnoticed. One of the biggest mistakes people make is assuming that communication is simply exchanging words. But real communication is about connection. It's about listening, not just to respond, but to understand. It's about creating a space where both people feel safe enough to be vulnerable. Most people think they're great communicators because they talk a lot, but talking at someone isn't the same as communicating with them. When we don't communicate clearly, we start filling in the blanks ourselves. We assume what the other person is thinking. We create our own stories in our minds. And more often than not, those stories are based on fear, insecurity, or past wounds. They don't care about me. They're not attracted to me anymore. They're purposely ignoring my needs. And once those thoughts take root, they shape how we behave. We withdraw, we lash out, we get defensive. And before we know it, we're no longer fighting the real issue. We're fighting the story we've created in our heads. Another dangerous habit is passive communication, when one or both partners avoid difficult conversations altogether. This happens when people are afraid of conflict or rejection, so they choose silence instead. But silence isn't peace, it's just avoidance disguised as harmony. Over time, resentment builds, and the relationship becomes filled with unspoken disappointments, leading to emotional distance. And then there's miscommunication, the times when words are spoken but they're misunderstood. Every person brings their own past, their own experiences, and their own way of interpreting things. You might say one thing, but the other person hears something completely different because of their own filters. I need space might be heard as, I don't love you. I'm stressed at work might be interpreted as, you're not important to me right now. Without clarity, even simple conversations can turn into conflicts. Communication is also about emotional honesty, being real about what you need and how you feel. But here's the problem. Most people aren't even honest with themselves. They suppress their emotions, push their needs aside, and expect their partner to read their mind. And when that doesn't happen, they feel unseen, unloved, or neglected. The cycle continues, and slowly what was once a deep connection starts to feel like two people living separate lives. Resentment is like a slow poison. It doesn't destroy a relationship overnight, but it builds up over time, eating away at trust, intimacy, and connection. It often starts small, so small that you barely notice it at first. A sarcastic comment that stings, a broken promise that never gets addressed, a moment where you felt unheard or dismissed. Maybe you tell yourself, it's not a big deal, or I don't want to make a fuss about it, but deep down, something shifts. A tiny seed of bitterness is planted, and if left unchecked, it grows into something much bigger. Most resentment doesn't come from what actually happened. It comes from what we tell ourselves about what happened. It's not just the forgotten anniversary. It's the belief that I'm not a priority. It's not just the dismissive tone in an argument. It's the thought that they don't respect me. It's not just feeling unheard. It's the story in your mind saying, I don't matter to them. These unspoken narratives play on repeat, shaping how you see the other person, how you respond to them, and ultimately how you feel about the relationship as a whole. One of the biggest dangers of unresolved resentment is that it doesn't just stay in the past. It bleeds into every interaction. A small disagreement over something trivial like who forgot to take out the trash can suddenly turn into a full-blown argument about everything that's ever gone wrong in the relationship. Why? Because it's not about the trash. It's about all the built-up frustration, the feeling of being unappreciated, the hurt that was never addressed. Resentment is like an emotional time bomb, waiting for the right trigger to explode. Some people express resentment outwardly, snapping over small things, making passive-aggressive comments, or stonewalling their partner. Others suppress it, pretending everything is fine on the surface while secretly keeping score. They may not even realize they're doing it, but every unresolved hurt becomes another tally mark in their mind. And the more those marks add up, the harder it becomes to see the other person with the same love and admiration they once had. Resentment also creates an invisible barrier in relationships. The warmth, the closeness, the desire to connect, it all starts to fade. When you're holding on to resentment, even loving gestures can feel empty. A compliment feels insincere. A kind act feels like an obligation rather than a genuine expression of care. You start to question their motives, doubting whether their affection is real or if they're just trying to keep the peace. It becomes harder and harder to be vulnerable because vulnerability requires trust, and trust can't exist when there's a storm of unresolved emotions beneath the surface. Another reason resentment is so destructive is that it changes who you are in the relationship. When you carry resentment, you're not just reacting to your partner, you're reacting to your past hurts. You become defensive, guarded, less willing to give the benefit of the doubt. You may start mirroring the very behaviors that hurt you in the first place, creating a cycle where both people feel wronged and neither wants to be the first to back down. Resentment doesn't just affect conflict, it also drains the passion and excitement from a relationship. Love thrives on openness, appreciation, and positive energy, but when you're weighed down by past disappointments, it's hard to experience joy in the present. You may still be physically present in the relationship, but emotionally, there's distance. That distance grows over time until one day you wake up and realize you're more like roommates than partners. The connection that once felt so natural now feels forced. And no matter how much you try to push it aside, the weight of unresolved emotions keeps pulling you apart. Growth is the lifeblood of any thriving relationship. The moment you stop growing, individually and as a couple, you start dying. It doesn't happen overnight, it happens slowly. In the little moments when you choose comfort over challenge, routine over discovery, and stagnation over evolution. At first, everything feels fine. But over time, that lack of growth creates a gap, one that gets wider and wider until the connection you once had starts to feel distant, unfamiliar, and even unsatisfying. One of the biggest mistakes people make in relationships is assuming that love alone is enough to sustain them. But love isn't a thing, it's a process. It's something you build, nurture, and strengthen over time. The relationship you start with is never the relationship you'll have 5, 10, or 20 years down the road. Life will throw new challenges, new desires, and new experiences your way, and if you're not growing together, you'll start growing apart. Neglecting growth doesn't always look dramatic. It's not always about someone refusing to improve themselves or actively resisting change. Sometimes it's just getting too comfortable. It's falling into autopilot mode, having the same conversations, doing the same things, going through the same routines. You wake up next to each other every day, but you stop seeing each other. You stop being curious about each other. You assume you already know them, forgetting that people are constantly evolving. And when you stop discovering each other, the relationship starts feeling stale, even if nothing is wrong on the surface. This lack of growth also creates an emotional gap. At the beginning of a relationship, there's excitement. You challenge each other, you inspire each other, you push each other to become better versions of yourselves. But when that stops happening, the dynamic shifts. One person might start feeling stuck, uninspired, or even resentful. They may start looking for that spark elsewhere, not necessarily in another person, but in something that makes them feel alive again. This is how people lose their passion, not just for the relationship, but for life itself. They stop setting goals. They stop striving for more. And that slow decay of personal ambition bleeds into the relationship, turning it into something that feels more like an obligation than a source of fulfillment. Another dangerous side effect of neglecting growth is misalignment. If one person continues to evolve while the other stays the same, tension builds. Maybe one person becomes more ambitious while the other becomes complacent. Maybe one starts prioritizing health and self-improvement while the other clings to old habits. What once felt like a perfect fit now feels like two completely different worlds. And when values, visions, and aspirations no longer align, frustration and disconnection take over. Sometimes neglecting growth is a result of fear. People resist change because it's uncomfortable. They'd rather stick with what's familiar, even if it's limiting, rather than step into the unknown. But comfort is the enemy of deep connection. When both partners stop challenging themselves and each other, they settle into roles rather than a relationship. They become two people who coexist rather than two people who ignite something in each other. Growth doesn't just mean achieving big goals or constantly striving for more. It means staying engaged, staying curious, and staying committed to becoming the best version of yourself. It means checking in, asking deeper questions, and continuing to invest in each other. Because the moment you assume the relationship will just work itself out without effort, that's the moment you start losing it. Appreciation is the glue that holds relationships together. It's what makes people feel seen, valued, and understood. In the beginning, appreciation is effortless. You're excited about the little things, how they laugh, how they support you, how they bring joy into your life. You express gratitude without even thinking about it, whether it's through words, actions, or just the way you look at them. But over time, something dangerous happens. Familiarity sets in. What once felt special starts to feel normal. What once amazed you becomes expected. And slowly, often without realizing it, you stop showing appreciation the way you used to. Loss of appreciation isn't always intentional. It happens subtly. At first, you assume they know how much you care, so you stop saying it out loud. You stop acknowledging the little things they do, the effort they put in, the kindness they show, the way they're always there for you. Maybe you still love them just as much, but the expression of that love fades. You focus more on what's missing than what's present, more on what frustrates you than what you admire. And when appreciation disappears, resentment, disconnection, and emotional distance take its place. One of the biggest reasons people stop feeling appreciated is that human nature is wired for adaptation. What once felt new and exciting eventually becomes routine. The thoughtful gestures, the daily acts of kindness, the qualities that made you fall in love, over time they become part of the background. You stop noticing them. And the problem isn't just that you don't express appreciation, it's that you feel it less. You get so used to their presence, their support, their love, that you stop recognizing how much it actually means to you. Until one day, you realize something feels different. The spark isn't as strong. The connection feels weaker. Not because the love is gone, but because it's no longer nurtured. Appreciation is a cycle. When someone feels valued, they're more likely to show love, to invest in the relationship, to bring their best self forward. But when someone feels taken for granted, they start pulling back. They stop putting in as much effort. They stop doing the little things that once made the relationship feel special, not out of malice, but out of exhaustion. Over time, the energy shifts. Instead of a relationship filled with warmth and gratitude, it becomes a relationship filled with unmet expectations and silent disappointments. The loss of appreciation also shifts the way conflicts play out. When you feel appreciated, small annoyances don't bother you as much. You're more forgiving, more patient, more understanding. But when appreciation is missing, every little flaw gets magnified. The same habits that once seemed cute or quirky now feel irritating. Instead of focusing on what's right, you fixate on what's wrong. Instead of feeling grateful for what they do, you start resenting what they don't do. And without realizing it, you begin seeing them through a filter of frustration rather than love. Another way loss of appreciation damages relationships is through emotional withdrawal. People want to feel valued not just for what they do, but for who they are. When that validation disappears, they start looking for it elsewhere. Sometimes that means withdrawing into their own world, focusing more on work, friends, or personal hobbies because they no longer feel emotionally fulfilled in the relationship. Other times it leads to deeper issues, seeking validation in unhealthy ways, whether through outside attention or internalized resentment. It's not always about needing grand gestures or constant praise. Sometimes it's just about wanting to hear, "I see you, I appreciate you, you matter to me." One of the most heartbreaking things about loss of appreciation is that people often don't realize how much they valued someone until it's too late. They assume that love alone will keep the relationship strong, that their partner knows how they feel, that the connection will last without effort. But relationships aren't built on assumptions. They're built on intentional actions. And when appreciation fades, love doesn't disappear immediately, but it does begin to weaken. Emotional reactivity is one of the most destructive forces in any relationship. It's what turns small disagreements into explosive fights, what makes misunderstandings feel like betrayals, and what transforms love into resentment. When emotions take over, logic, patience, and understanding go out the window. Instead of responding with intention, you react on impulse. Instead of solving the problem, you escalate it. And the worst part? You often don't even realize it's happening until the damage is already done. At its core, emotional reactivity is a survival mechanism. When something triggers us, whether it's a hurtful comment, a dismissive tone, or an unmet expectation, our brain sees it as a threat. It activates the fight or flight response, flooding our system with adrenaline and cortisol. In that moment, it doesn't matter if the threat is just a minor disagreement or an actual attack. Our body reacts the same way. Our breathing quickens, our heart races, and suddenly we're no longer thinking rationally. We're in defense mode, ready to fight, withdraw, or shut down. This is why emotional reactivity often leads to regrettable words and actions. You're not responding from a place of clarity, you're reacting from a place of pain, fear, or anger. You might lash out, say something hurtful, or bring up old wounds just to make the other person feel as bad as you do in that moment. Or you might completely shut down, refusing to communicate, withdrawing emotionally, and building walls that push your partner further away. Either way, the outcome is the same. Deeper disconnection, more unresolved tension, and a cycle that keeps repeating itself. One of the biggest problems with emotional reactivity is that it creates a toxic feedback loop. When one person reacts emotionally, it triggers the other person to do the same. If you yell, they yell louder. If you get defensive, they match your energy. If you shut down, they either chase you for a response or withdraw as well. And before you know it, you're no longer dealing with the real issue. You're just reacting to each other's reactions. The conversation shifts from how do we fix this to who's going to win this battle. And in that kind of dynamic, nobody truly wins. Emotional reactivity also distorts reality. When you're in a reactive state, everything feels more extreme. A simple disagreement suddenly feels like proof that your partner doesn't care about you. A forgotten favor feels like a personal attack. A misinterpreted tone feels like deliberate disrespect. Your mind starts exaggerating the situation, convincing you that the worst case scenario is true. And once that narrative takes hold, it fuels even more reactivity, making it nearly impossible to approach the situation with calmness and clarity. Another dangerous aspect of emotional reactivity is that it reinforces negative patterns. Every time you allow emotions to control your response, you strengthen that neural pathway in your brain. You make it easier for that reaction to happen again in the future. If your go-to response is yelling, that becomes your default. If your habit is shutting down, that behavior becomes ingrained. Over time, these patterns become automatic, and unless you consciously work to break them, they will keep replaying in your relationship like a broken record. Emotional reactivity doesn't just affect arguments, it also impacts trust and emotional safety. When someone feels like they have to walk on eggshells around you, they stop opening up, they start filtering their words, avoiding difficult conversations, and suppressing their true feelings just to keep the peace. This creates emotional distance, and when that distance grows, the relationship starts feeling less like a partnership and more like a ticking time bomb waiting for the next explosion. The worst part is that emotional reactivity often comes from deep-rooted wounds, past experiences, childhood conditioning, or unresolved traumas. Sometimes you're not even reacting to your partner, you're reacting to something from your past that their words or actions unknowingly triggered. Maybe their tone reminds you of a parent who used to criticize you. Maybe their lack of response triggers a fear of abandonment. Without self-awareness, these unconscious wounds dictate how you behave, making you relive old pain in a completely new situation. Left unchecked, emotional reactivity doesn't just damage communication, it erodes love. It turns relationships into battlefields where both people are constantly on edge, anticipating the next fight. It creates a dynamic where connection becomes secondary to survival, where feeling right becomes more important than feeling close. And over time, that wears down even the strongest of bonds. When two people come together in a relationship, it's easy to assume that love will be enough to sustain them. In the beginning, chemistry is strong, emotions are high, and differences don't seem to matter as much. But as time goes on, the foundation of any lasting relationship is not just love, it's alignment. Alignment in values, in vision, in the things that truly matter at the deepest level. Because when two people are fundamentally misaligned in these areas, no amount of passion, commitment, or even effort can create the deep, lasting connection that makes a relationship thrive. Misaligned values don't always show up right away. Early on, people focus on their similarities, their shared experiences, and their chemistry. But as life progresses and real challenges arise, the deeper foundational aspects of a relationship begin to reveal themselves. What do you both believe about family, about money, about personal growth, about spirituality, career, or how you want to live your life? These aren't just abstract concepts. They shape daily decisions, priorities, and the direction of your future. And when two people are not on the same page about these things, conflict is inevitable. At first, misaligned values might seem like small compromises. One person wants to travel the world while the other prefers stability. One values financial security while the other prioritizes freedom and experience. One person believes in personal development and constant growth while the other is content with where they are. Individually, these may seem like minor differences, but over time, they create tension. What starts as simple disagreements turns into ongoing frustration, a sense that you're not moving in the same direction, and eventually that tension leads to resentment, distance, and disconnection. One of the most damaging aspects of misaligned values is that it forces one or both partners to suppress their true desires. Maybe one person sacrifices their dreams to maintain harmony, convincing themselves that love is more important than personal fulfillment. Maybe one person constantly compromises, adjusting their goals to fit the relationship rather than pursuing what truly matters to them. But suppression always leads to unhappiness, and unhappiness over time turns into resentment. No one wants to feel like they had to give up parts of themselves to make a relationship work, and when one or both partners feel like they've lost themselves, the foundation of the relationship begins to crumble. Misaligned values don't just create conflict, they create a feeling of emotional loneliness. Even if you love each other, even if you want the relationship to work, if you're not aligned in vision and purpose, you start feeling like you're living parallel lives rather than building something together. There's a difference between coexisting and truly growing as a team. Coexisting is when you share a home, a routine, maybe even a family, but your hearts and minds are moving in different directions. Growth happens when both partners are deeply invested in the same future, actively supporting and challenging each other in ways that elevate both people. The challenge with misalignment is that it's not always obvious in the beginning. People are often willing to overlook differences when they're caught up in love. But over time, those differences don't disappear. they magnify. The further you go in life, the more important alignment becomes. The small differences you ignored early on become the very things that make you feel disconnected later. The key is not just compatibility, it's shared vision. Because even the most passionate love will struggle to survive if both people are walking separate paths. Another consequence of misaligned values is that it changes how conflicts unfold. When two people share a core vision, even disagreements have a common ground. There's an understanding that no matter what, you're working toward the same goal. But when values are misaligned, conflicts become about proving who's right rather than finding a solution. Each person is fighting for their own perspective, trying to pull the other in their direction rather than working toward a unified outcome. And that constant battle creates exhaustion, frustration, and an emotional gap that widens over time. Sometimes misalignment comes from change. The person you were at the start of the relationship is not always the person you are years later. Growth is natural, and sometimes two people grow in different directions. It's not always about one person being wrong and the other being right. It's about whether or not both people are evolving in a way that still fits together. A relationship that once felt perfect can start to feel like a struggle simply because the visions that once aligned are now pulling in opposite directions. The reality is, love alone is not enough. Passion is not enough. Shared experiences and history are not enough. A relationship that truly lasts, that truly thrives, is one where both people are deeply committed to the same core values, the same long-term vision, and the same journey of growth. Because when alignment is missing, no matter how much you may want it to work, the relationship will always feel like an uphill battle. At the core of every thriving relationship is intentionality, the willingness to communicate, to appreciate, to grow, and to align with each other's deepest values. Relationships don't fail overnight. They erode gradually through the small, unnoticed moments of neglect, misalignment, and emotional reactivity. When communication breaks down, resentment builds. When appreciation fades, connection weakens. When growth is ignored, passion diminishes. And when values and vision don't align, two people start moving in different directions, even if they still love each other. But the good news is this: relationships don't have to break down. Every single one of these destructive patterns can be identified, understood, and transformed if both people are willing to do the work. It takes self-awareness, vulnerability, and the courage to confront the uncomfortable truths that are holding you back. It requires breaking old habits, challenging emotional reactivity, and making a conscious decision to show up as your best self every single day. Because love isn't just something you feel, it's something you build. And the strongest relationships aren't the ones without challenges, they're the ones where both people commit to growing through those challenges together.